Welcome. So we'll continue in this video to talk about some project ideas. So I'm going to introduce you to a very important concept called API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. We'll do a few walkthrough demos of publicly available web APIs, and then I'll also give you some stretch goals on what all you can do with regard to data engineering. So this is of course deployed on the cloud. This is a stretch idea, but just to give you a basis for getting your products idea on. All right, so let's get started. Let's get introduced to the concept of APIs. APIs stand for Application Programming Interface. So this is a very abstract idea, but the whole concept behind API is essentially helping multiple applications interface with each other, right? So that is why it's called Application Programming Interface. So we have used actually API in multiple cases. For example, since all of you are familiar with Python and the pandas library, so pandas is written as an API. So when you instantiate your pandas data frame and when you do dot shape, the computer knows what you are requiring it to do, right? And then if you do a filter on it or do a map or apply operation, it does know. So it's all abstracted. The code behind it, you are not writing the code every time. All of it is abstracted for us, right? So pandas or scikit-learn, etc. are written in an API format. So in this module, we are of course going to talk about web APIs. So web APIs are essentially a good way of how we retrieve or manipulate data from the World Wide Web, right? And it uses a protocol called HTTP. So HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So it is protocol essentially means a set of rules for exchanging data or passing data around on the web, right? Hypertext refers to the HTML. So we have already seen, right? So whenever you go to you make a request to a server, then what happens is what gets returned back to you is a HTML page, right? Transfer is moving stuff around and protocol is essentially set of rules. So I want you to do this experiment. Open up your terminal or your command prompt and do a curl of www.example.com. Alright, so what this is doing is the curl operation is making a request to www.example.com. So very similar to the image that is shown here. So we whenever we are accessing any information on the web, right, we are making a request to the server. The server has a corresponding HTML page, so it gets passed to our browser. The browser knows how to interpret the HTML page, so it renders it in a very nice systematic design way, right? So the curl, if you use this, if you run it on a command prompt, you will see that the entire HTML page is actually listed on your command prompt itself. So other APIs that you can try are essentially go to your poke API, right? So pokeapi.co is an API that gives you information about a lot of Pokemon characters, right? So one way to look at it is you can of course go to the API on the web browser, right? So if you do curl of pokeapi.co/API/v2 Pokemon and give a specific Pokemon name. So then the output you get is not HTML. Typically in an when you are accessing the web, the output is HTML, but in a lot of API calls that you do, the output is JSON, right? JavaScript object notation format, which is we are all familiar with. All right. So you can sort of go to these websites and try. In this slide, I have listed down some of the web APIs that you can consider for your final project. So why are we talking about API as part of your project idea? You can consider to bring a data source as from an API source, from an open data source, right? One of your data source can be from an application programming interface API. So for example, if you are looking at agricultural data, or let's say even restaurant footfall data, etc., then it makes sense to sort of merge that with your weather API. So you want to bring data from your weather API for a particular region. So if you are working on data from a financial perspective, so some of the data that you have is finance related structured data, so then you can bring in data of the stock market. So one such provider is Alpha Vantage, right? So then of course Pokemon is more of a entertainment related thing, API provider. So there are different types of API. So you have the common open API, right, which is typically a B2C kind of API. So for example, Google Maps is available for all of us for use in our phones, but it's also used by a number of these ride hailing services. For example, Grab in Singapore, or Uber or Ola sometimes use Google Maps, right? So there is another kind of API, which is a partner API, which is typically B2B. So you'll have to sign up with an API and sign up for a API key code, right? That is what I will demonstrate in our API lab. And then you have internal APIs also. So some organizations are big that they might want to transfer data within each department, right? Within an enterprise, there can be internal sharing of API. So in the next slide, we are going to see demo of a few APIs, including the API lab of the Python project for data engineering.
In this code walkthrough, I'm going to go through how do you access a web API, right? So in this activity, we are actually going to use the exchange rate API that will extract currency exchange rate data. All right. There are different ways of implementing APIs. Some are free APIs, but for some you need an API key. So you go ahead and sign up for one. So the instructions are given. So once you sign up so this is the exchange rate API page itself. So you need to understand when you are accessing an API, you want to go and look at the documentation, right? So the documentation gives you a lot of information. So one of the first information is how do you actually call the API, right? Which is the URL for the API. And then many APIs have several endpoints, right? So endpoint for getting the latest rate, endpoint for conversion, endpoint for historical rates, or if you want to get time series data, for example, or fluctuation data in terms of the exchange rate. So each of it, you will have a specific URL to go for, right? So in some cases, I think in this API, you can use an API key as far as you are making only 250 calls per month. Your calls will be, your data will be returned. If you're doing more, of course, you will have to go to the next slab of pricing. Okay, so in this case, here I'm just looking at one of the endpoint, which is using my base currency, and I provide the API key. Right, so then I do a request.get URL. So depending on how busy the server is, this does take a bit of time. Sometimes you might get a timeout information, or if your endpoint is not very, it is incorrect, right? So if this URL is incorrect, so it is also going to give you a bunch of error codes. So you can look up in the documentation what each error code is. So the first few times I ran it, it gave me timeout error. That was probably because I was getting, probably it was not active, the server, but now it's active. So I get the exchange rate corresponding to euro. So you can go ahead with the rest of the steps. Then you know how to convert a JSON into your pandas data frame, etc. All right. So this is one web API. So I wanted to also quickly talk about another web API. So for example, reddit.com. So we are all familiar with it. It's one of the social media platforms, right? So Reddit has a bunch of subreddits like sports, under sports you have running, soccer, etc. And then you have world news, right? So if you look at a subreddit is all the posts corresponding to a particular topic, essentially, right? So if you want to scrape something like this, Reddit does a very neat trick. So if you just go to the URL and then say worldnews.json, it gives you the entire page as a JSON file. So, of course, you will have to spend some time to look through it, but it's actually structured and there are documentation available for going through it. So, if you are interested to scrape Reddit on a regular basis and porting it into your MongoDB, which is essentially a document DB, right? So, you can do that and then do analytics on that. So, some ideas to think about.
I'm going to just walk through a end-to-end use case that I helped develop for creating an end-to-end pipeline on the cloud. Right, so this is a news sentiment analysis example. So this is a real world example using real world data. So the reason for bringing this into the project idea is to ensure that you can think of similar use cases which might be relevant to your industry, right? So the use case here is fairly simple. So the idea is to extract news article information from a Guardian API, which is one of the news publishers, right? Based on topics. So there will be different topics of interest, right? That could be the Russia-Ukraine war, or it could be the recession, or what's the budget, for example, Indian budget, etc. Right? So you are essentially extracting information on a particular topic, and then you are sending it to a sentiment analyzer to see how the sentiments vary on a daily basis with respect to the news. So the news sentiment analysis, the equivalent of an ETL here is you read data from an API, which is the news article about a particular country. Let's say you are trying to see what's the sentiment of different countries, for example. So you, from the Guardian API, you are looking to read data from about a particular country. So get the news article and then you can store it in a database, right? Typically, as we have seen, API data comes in the format JSON. So you can store it in a document database, which might be the most efficient way to do it. Then you can call a transform function that classifies the news article or extracts a sentiment score for the news article and publish the result. So I'm just going to go through the different components that were involved. So this was deployed on the cloud using what is called AWS cloud services. So here there was a trigger that was coded in order to start looking for the data, right? So this was one of the services that's provided by AWS called Event Bridge. So you can create an event which is triggered on an hourly basis, or let's say on a everyday basis, to go and fetch the relevant data. So then comes the, so the next part was at the end of, when the trigger happens, the cloud essentially calls a component which basically is written in a Lambda function. So Lambda is a microservice, right? So we have listed multiple topics like Ukraine, COVID, Russia, India, etc. And then you can see that for the selected topics, we are selecting only one topic per hour. in this particular code. Of course, it can do slightly different things. So if you look at this slide is essentially within the Lambda function. It is calling the content.guardianapis.com, right? So that's the API call that's being made in order to get the news article corresponding to the topic that's of interest. And then finally, we now call another web service, right, to classify the news article as whether it's a positive or negative sentiment, or give it a sort of sentiment score, right? So if you look at it, your data is being, so all of this is implemented as a series of what is called microservices in order to make each of them can be scaled independently. Right, so AWS gives you that flexibility. So all of this, the entire thing is deployed on the cloud. So this is the this is the actual classification code, the sentiment classification or the sentiment scorer code, which is also run as a Lambda function, a microservice on AWS. So the whole idea of walking through this is how the end-to-end can also be done on the cloud, but that is not an expectation in your project, just to be very clear about that. But this is to help you to jog some ideas on what are all potential topics that you can consider for your project. Alright, so in this video, we had a very quick introduction to the application programming interface, and we took a demo of some of the web-based API. One of it corresponding to your Python project for data engineering, where you did exchange rate. And then in that video, I also looked at how do you go and look at a Reddit API, right? And then I walked through a full end-to-end implementation of a news analysis example, news sentiment analysis, so that you will get some ideas on where to get your project started. So in the reference of this PPT, I have also given you a list of publicly available APIs. I cannot guarantee if all of them are functional, but that will give you a sense of what kind of data you can bring in and use for your data engineering projects. Thank you.